The morning after my daughter's bridal shower, I sat in my car outside my notary's office on Elgin Street for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. It was March, one of those Ottawa mornings where the cold comes up through the pavement and your breath disappears the moment it leaves your mouth. I had the folder on the passenger seat. I had made up my mind the night before, somewhere between washing the dishes alone at midnight and watching the streetlight outside my kitchen window. I just needed to walk through the door. My notary, a quiet man named Harold who had handled my affairs for nearly 20 years, looked up when I came in and must have seen something in my face, because he didn't ask how I was. He just gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited. I told him I needed to change my will. He set down his pen. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're trying to decide if you're grieving or if you're certain. Then he said very carefully, "Evelyn, are you sure about this?" I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life. My daughter Cassandra had been engaged for 7 months when her future mother-in-law organized the bridal shower at their family home in Rockcliffe Park. If you're not from Ottawa, Rockcliffe is old money. The kind of neighborhood where the houses sit so far back from the street you can barely see them. The kind of neighborhood where people have opinions about which private school your children attended, and those opinions matter to them in ways that are genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who didn't grow up there. I did not grow up there. I grew up in Vanier, in a small house on Barrett Street with my mother and my younger brother, and my mother worked nights at the printing plant on Belfast Road until her knees gave out. I learned early that you either figure out how to build something from nothing or you spend your whole life apologizing for what you don't have. I chose not to apologize. I was 26 when I started my first alterations business out of the spare room of my apartment on Rideau. Just a sewing machine, a dress form, and a card I put up at the dry cleaners on Donald Street. Within 4 years I had a proper shop. Within 12 I had 3. By the time Cassandra was finishing her degree at Carleton, I had quietly accumulated a portfolio of small commercial properties along Beechwood and in the Glebe, the same buildings my tenants ran their bakeries and bookshops and yoga studios out of. Buildings I had purchased one at a time over 30 years, always carefully, always without fanfare. I drove a sensible car. I wore sensible clothes. I cooked my own meals and I fixed things myself when they broke, and I never once felt the need to explain to anyone what I was worth. Cassandra knew I owned the shops. She did not know the full picture. I had always told myself I would tell her when the time was right, when she was settled, when it felt natural. The truth, if I'm honest, is that I like being underestimated. I had spent enough years being looked through to understand there was a kind of power in it. Her fiancé, whose name was Brent, was a perfectly pleasant young man who worked in finance downtown and seemed to genuinely love my daughter. I had no complaint about Brent. His family was another matter. His mother, Heloise, and she always introduced herself with the full name. Never Hel, never anything shorter, always Heloise, with a slight pause afterward, as though she expected you to recognize it, was the kind of woman who had decided early in life exactly who belonged in her world and who did not. She had married into Brent's father's family money, had spent 30 years curating a social life that revolved around the right charity galas and the right club memberships and the right address, and she wore all of it like armor. She was not cruel exactly. She was something more refined than cruel. She was dismissive, and there is something about being dismissed by someone who hasn't bothered to look at you closely enough to actually see you that goes in deeper than cruelty does. I had met her 4 times before the bridal shower. Each time she had shaken my hand warmly, asked polite questions about my shops. How lovely. Alterations, that must keep you busy, and then turned her attention elsewhere. I was texture to Heloise, background detail, the mother of the girl her son had chosen, present out of obligation, to be managed graciously and then forgotten. I had sewn Cassandra's shower gift myself. I want you to understand what that means, so I'm going to tell you exactly what it was. When Cassandra was 4 years old, she went through a phase where she refused to wear anything that didn't have what she called a twirl factor. Dresses had to spin, skirts had to float. She would stand in the middle of the kitchen and spin until she fell down laughing. I started making her clothes then, partly because I was a seamstress and it was practical, and partly because I loved watching her face when she tried something on and it moved exactly the way she'd hoped. For the shower, I had made her a dressing gown, not the kind you buy flat-packed in cellophane at the Bay. I had found a bolt of silk charmeuse in a deep champagne color at Herschel's on Sparks. They've closed now, but it used to be the best fabric supplier in the city, and I had spent 11 weeks working on it in the evenings after the shops closed. It had a full-length skirt with a slight sweep, a crossover front, and along the collar and cuffs I had done smocking by hand, tiny pleats the width of my thumbnail, the way my own mother had taught me on a scrap of cotton in our kitchen on Barrett Street when I was 9 years old. Inside the left cuff, where only Cassandra would see it, I had embroidered a small figure, a little woman in a twirling skirt, arms out mid-spin. It was the most careful thing I had made in 30 years. I packed it in a cedar-lined box I had kept since my mother died, wrapped in the same tissue paper she used to save from Christmas. The shower was on a Sunday afternoon in late February. 22 women in Heloise's living room, which was the size of my entire ground floor and featured a fireplace you could stand inside. The other guests were Heloise's friends, Brent's aunts, a handful of Cassandra's university friends who looked as disoriented as I felt. There were flowers everywhere, white and pale green, and a catered lunch from a company whose van I recognized because their commissary kitchen was in one of my buildings on Beechwood. I didn't mention that. Cassandra sat in a chair that had been positioned near the window for the gift-opening portion of the afternoon. I watched her open shower gifts for 40 minutes, a KitchenAid stand mixer, a set of Le Creuset in sage green, monogrammed linen napkins, a weekend at an inn in Prince Edward County, and she thanked each person beautifully. And I watched her and thought about the little girl spinning in my kitchen. When she got to my box, she lifted the lid and moved the tissue paper aside and went very still. She touched the smocking along the collar with 2 fingers, very gently, and I saw her throat move. Then Heloise, who was seated to my left, leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice that carried easily across the room because she had never in her life needed to lower it, "How sweet! Did you make that yourself?" She was smiling. The smile was warm and perfectly calibrated. A little homemade keepsake. How absolutely darling. She said it the way you'd speak about a child's drawing taped to a refrigerator, the way you'd speak about something you'd never actually use, something sweet and slightly embarrassing, something that belonged in a different context, in a smaller house, among people with smaller lives. The room shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, the way air moves when a window opens. A few women looked at their hands. One of Heloise's friends made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. One of Cassandra's university friends looked stricken, and my daughter looked at me. She looked at me for 3 full seconds, and I watched something move across her face. Guilt, I think, and love, and the particular helplessness of someone who wants to say something and can't find where to put it. And then she looked back down at the gown in her lap and said softly, "It's beautiful, Mum." That was all. Heloise had already moved on, gesturing to one of the catering staff to bring around the dessert tray. I sat with my hands in my lap and my cup of tea, and I thought about the 11 weeks of evenings. I thought about my mother's hands showing me how to work a smocking needle. I thought about the cedar box. And I sat there and I was quiet and I was perfectly composed, the way I have learned to be quiet and composed in rooms where the people around me have decided they already know what I am. I stayed until the end because I am not someone who makes scenes. On the drive back to my house on Springfield Road, I passed 3 of my buildings on Beechwood. I looked at them the way I always do, checking the signage, the condition of the awnings, the lights in the windows, all fine, all mine. That night I called my brother Terry, who lives in a condo in Westboro and who has known me longer than anyone alive. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said I wasn't sure yet, but I was already thinking. Let me tell you something about the will I had written 12 years earlier. Cassandra was the sole beneficiary of my estate, which at that point was valued conservatively by my accountant Philip, who is also methodical about understatement, at somewhere in the range of $4.2 million. The commercial properties alone generated just over $380,000 a year in rental income. There were also the 3 businesses, the investments, the house, and a life insurance policy I'd carried since Cassandra was 8. Helios had made a darling keepsake joke about a dressing gown sewn by a woman who was worth more than the house we were sitting in. I was not angry in the way people expect anger to look. I wasn't shaking. I didn't need to raise my voice. What I felt was something quieter and more settled than anger, the feeling of something finally becoming very clear. Harold's office is on Elgin, as I said, 1 floor above a tax consultant and across the street from a coffee shop I've been going to for 15 years. I sat across from him the next morning with my folder on the table, and I told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to establish a charitable trust. The trust would receive the majority of my estate, the properties, the business assets, the investments. Its mandate would be to provide subsidized commercial rent to women-owned small businesses in Ottawa's lower-income neighborhoods, specifically in Vanier, Overbrook, and Hintonburg. The model I had in mind was simple. Properties held in perpetuity, rents set at 60% of market rate. Priority given to women who were starting out, women who were doing what I had done, working from a spare room or a kitchen table or a borrowed space, trying to build something from a starting point that most people would call nothing. I would name it after my mother, the Marion Leclerc Business Trust. My mother's name was Marion, and her maiden name was Leclerc, and she died at 71 with not very much money and an enormous amount of dignity, and I have missed her every single day since. Cassandra would still inherit the house on Springfield Road and a sum sufficient to live comfortably. She would not be left with nothing. I was not trying to punish her for being human, for being caught in a room full of people whose approval she had spent 2 years quietly working for. I understood that. I had been young once. I had wanted things from people who weren't going to give them. But I was 63 years old. I had spent 4 decades building something in a city that had mostly ignored me while I was doing it, and I had done it in my mother's honor and in the honor of every woman I'd ever watched start over with nothing. What I was leaving behind was not a number. It was a door, and I wanted it to stay open for people who needed it. Harold listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "This is a significant change," he said. I told him I was aware. "Have you spoken to Cassandra?" I said not yet. He looked at me for a moment. "Do you want to?" I thought about it honestly. I thought about her face when she touched the smocking. I thought about the 3 seconds when she looked at me. I thought about "It's beautiful, Mum," said softly into the room, and how much it must have cost her to say it, and how much more it might have cost her to say anything else. "Yes," I said, "eventually, but not today." I called Cassandra on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after I'd signed the new documents. I asked her to come for dinner. She came on Saturday, and I made the lamb shoulder with rosemary and the roasted carrots, the way she's always liked them. And we sat at my kitchen table the way we had sat at kitchen tables her whole life. And I told her everything, the properties, the trust, what it would be called, why. She was quiet for a long time. I let her be. Then she said, I should have said something that day. I said, yes. She looked at me. Her eyes were full. I didn't know how. I said, I know. I'm sorry, Mum. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. I believed her completely. She was not apologizing to protect an inheritance. She didn't know yet what the inheritance would be. She was apologizing because she is, underneath everything, a woman with a conscience, and she had spent 3 weeks with the weight of what she hadn't done pressing on her in the night. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. I told her that the house would be hers, that there would be enough, that I was not doing this to hurt her. I told her about Marion Leclerc, about Barrett Street, about the kitchen table where my mother taught me smocking with a needle and a scrap of cotton, and the patience of someone who knew that the things made slowly and by hand were the only things that lasted. Cassandra asked if she could see the dressing gown. I had taken it back before I left the shower, folded it back into the cedar box in the hallway while the other guests were getting their coats. No one stopped me. No one said a word. I went and got the box and brought it to the kitchen, and she lifted it out and held it in front of her and looked at it for a long time. Then she found the little embroidered figure inside the left cuff, the woman in the twirling skirt, and she pressed her hand flat over it, and she cried. She wore it home that night. She has worn it since, I know, because she told me. The Marion Leclerc Business Trust was formalized that spring. The first 3 tenants moved into the Beechwood properties in October. A woman doing alterations and custom tailoring, a baker who made Ukrainian pastries the way her grandmother had taught her, and a woman who had started a small legal aid referral service out of her apartment and needed a real address to put on her letterhead. My accountant sent me the paperwork. I read through it at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same table where Cassandra and I had eaten lamb on a Saturday night, the same table where I had sat the night of the shower with the street light coming through the window. I thought about my mother. I thought about her hands. I thought about what she built from what she had, and what I had built from what she gave me, and what might be built now by women I would never meet, in rooms I would never see, starting from the beginning the way we all do, with almost nothing and everything ahead. I thought it was enough, more than enough. I went to bed feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the story was exactly the right length. I keep thinking about that moment when Harold set his glasses down on the desk and looked at me. He didn't ask if I was upset. He asked if I was sure. There's a difference, and he knew it. Being sure and being upset are 2 entirely different things, and I had spent enough of my life confusing them to understand a distinction by now. What happened at that shower was not a catastrophe. It was a clarity. Heloise said what she said. Cassandra stayed quiet, and something that had been vague and shapeless in my chest for years came into focus all at once. Not bitterness. I want to be careful about that word. More like recognition. The recognition that how we treat what someone is made with their hands tells you everything about how we value what they made it from. I had sewn that gown from 11 weeks of evenings, from my mother's hands and mine, from 40 years of getting up early and staying late and never once asking anyone to notice. When Heloise laughed at it, she wasn't laughing at silk charmeuse and smocking. She was laughing at the premise that a woman like me could make something worth taking seriously. That's a different kind of insult, and it takes a different kind of answer. The answer I gave was the trust, the Marion Leclerc Business Trust. I have thought, since then, about whether it was the right response or simply a satisfying one, and I have come to believe that in this case they were the same thing. What I built over 30 years was not built to impress Heloise. It was built because my mother taught me that the only honest answer to a world that underestimates you is to become something it can't ignore, not loudly, not to prove a point, but quietly and steadily, and with your eyes forward. That is not stubbornness. That is the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. There's a version of the story where I confront Helias at the shower, where I say the number out loud, watch her face change, and walk out with my dignity reclaimed in front of 22 witnesses. I thought about that version. I understand its appeal, but the truth is that the real work of a life doesn't happen in the moment of revelation. It happens in the 30 years before it. It happens in the decision to keep going when nobody is watching and nobody is impressed, and the building you just bought looks to most people like a very expensive problem. What I wanted to give Cassandra was not a lesson. I'm not interested in teaching through punishment. What I wanted was for her to sit across from me at my kitchen table and understand, finally, the full shape of what I had been doing all this time, and then to decide, with that knowledge, what kind of woman she was going to be going forward. That is the only kind of character that matters. Not the kind performed for a room, but the kind that shows up when there's no one left to impress. She wore the gown home that night. She found the little embroidered figure inside the cuff, and she cried. And I think what she was crying about was not the gown exactly, but the years she hadn't looked closely enough to see it. That's enough for me. That has always been enough. The first tenant in the Beechwood building was a seamstress. I didn't plan that. Some things arrange themselves in ways that feel almost too deliberate to be accidental, and you learn after a while to simply receive them. My mother would have liked that very much.